Let me share a story about Nina and her husband's guy's night out that she refused to pay for. The divorce was filed but moving slowly. Nina always paid the bills, but when she opened the joint credit card statement this month, she was in for quite a surprise. There was a $1,000 charge for a night out in the city. It looked like a hotel and a nice dinner and a bar crawl were all part of the evening festivities, except she wasn't the one who enjoyed the night away. She knew right away that it was from her husband's guy's night out last month. When she confronted him, he told her just to pay it off with the money in the savings. Nina refused. She insisted that she didn't get to enjoy the night out, and if she took the money out of the joint savings, that would be less that she received when it was divided up. Her husband told her to go shopping and then they would be even. But Nina didn't really want to do that. She was a saver and she was trying to be cautious with spending money right now, especially since the future was unknown. So instead, she stopped depositing her pay into the joint bank account, the account that household bills were paid from. Then she called the credit card company and put a freeze on the card so neither of them could use it. She didn't care that her husband had a few automatic payments applied to this account. He was wrong to use their joint card and expect her to use their money to pay for it. When her husband went to charge lunch the next day, the card was declined. He was so irate, he went to the bank and withdrew all of the money from their savings account, and he too changed his pay so that it was deposited into his sole account moving forward. Nina called her lawyer, who promptly filed a motion in court. Then, after spending almost a full day in court, the judge said that the money had to be returned to the account. But when Nina got her attorney's bill, she saw that it cost her more money to fight over this than actually was used by her husband. Also, now there wasn't enough money in the joint account to pay bills, and lawyers had to be called again. Perhaps if Nina and her husband had a plan at the beginning of their divorce, they could have avoided all of this. Figuring out what to do with bills and bank accounts is often overlooked until something like Nina's story happens. Then it becomes a scramble after the fact, which can be an expensive endeavor. Tactics without strategy is noise before defeat. In other words, Nina and her husband each engaged in a tactic to take control of the money, because that's what it was really about. But really, it just cost them more money to argue over it. What do you do to avoid this? Put a concrete plan into practice now to avoid costly arguments later. Even if you've decided to sustain the status quo of how expenses are paid, this is a good conversation to have with your spouse to make sure everyone knows the guidelines of what is acceptable. In almost every case I've ever handled, even the most amicable ones, an issue like this comes up at some point. Someone spends more money than usual and someone else gets angry. So get ahead of it by having the cash conversation early on. To start this conversation, start with your income. If you don't know this already, figure out how much total income is coming into your house from all sources. Often people don't know this because they don't pay attention. Just look at some bank statements if your income is direct deposited, or look at your pay stubs. The goal is to add up both your income and that of your spouse so that you have one total number. Next, you're going to create two lists. On one side, you'll write down everything that is a joint expense, such as the mortgage, utilities, children's expenses, joint credit cards that you both use, insurance, and so on. It doesn't matter who's paying what right now. It all goes down on the joint side because these are expenses that you have to pay on a regular basis. I would put cars on this list too because you both need to drive. It doesn't matter whose name is on the vehicle. Create this list together so you both can agree on what is considered a joint expense. If you can't get your spouse to sit down with you to do this, then you can do this exercise on your own and present it to your spouse after the fact, or provide it to your attorney. After you have a list of joint expenses, on the other side, you'll write down your individual expenses. These are the expenses that are not necessary to run a household, but they are personal to you, such as personal care, maybe a gym membership, the credit card that only you use, perhaps. Now, if you have a sole credit card, but on it are groceries and expenses for the children, this should go on the joint side. As you decide which expense goes where, ask yourself, does my spouse or household benefit from this expense? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a joint expense. If the answer is no, then it's personal. Your husband doesn't really benefit from your manicure, and you don't benefit from the round of golf he played Friday afternoon. Your spouse will be jotting down his own expenses too. If he's not a willing participant, do your best to create his list. This part is important because often people talk in concepts and it's hard to reach an agreement on an overview. When you break it down into bite-sized, fact-based information, it's easier to take small steps to reach an understanding. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. So when you're done with this exercise, you will have a master list of joint expenses, and each of you will have a list of your sole expenses. Now you will create a chart that looks something like this. Every expense on all of your lists will end up on this chart, and each will have a designation of who is paying what. For example, let's pretend this is Nina's chart. We've agreed that the mortgage will come out of the joint account. They also know that their gym memberships will be paid for by themselves individually. If we just said Nina pays her bills and her husband pays his, I can almost guarantee they're going to get tripped up in what constitutes his bills and her bills as the weeks and months go on. But if we break it down expense by expense, you'll have a clear understanding of what will happen each month. Your chart might look different and you may not have anything being paid from a joint account, but the chart will clearly set out who is paying what. If you do want to continue to pay bills from the joint account, now you know exactly how much is needed to fund this account each month. So you can agree on which portion of your income goes into the account and then the remainder goes into your individual accounts. You both can share this chart with your attorney so everyone knows what is supposed to happen, how bills are to be paid, and who is responsible for what. If you want, you can even have this entered as a court order that is enforceable, but often that isn't necessary if you've done this work and everyone is on the same page. What happens if your spouse pays all of the bills because you don't work? In that case, it would still be a good idea for you to go through each step to identify the bills that are out there, because when it comes time to talk about support and alimony, which is in video 2 of this pillar, you need to have an understanding of what your budget might look like. Use the Roadmap to Renewal workbook to assist in this work. We are not done just yet though. Now that we spoke about how bills are paid during your divorce, let's take just another minute and talk about what to do with your existing joint bank accounts. Remember, because Nina and her husband didn't have a plan, Nina thought she was outsmarting her husband by freezing the credit card, and her husband thought he would one-up her by taking out all of the money from their savings. Don't go rogue. Courts don't like it when people play games with money. In fact, they can penalize someone who does. In Nina's case, her lawyer filed a motion and they had to go to court, and while she won because her husband had to return the money to the savings, ultimately she lost because she spent even more money on her lawyer than what her husband spent. And he had to pay his lawyer as well. That was money that could have been used for something much better. This can be avoided by simply having a conversation about what to do with joint accounts right now. If you reach an agreement, the courts don't care what you do. They're not in the business of creating conflict. They're only in the business of resolving problems that you can't find solutions for. You have a couple of options about how to divide bank accounts. You can each take half, or you can leave it entirely intact. If you decide to leave the money in a joint account, be sure to have a conversation about what is an acceptable reason to withdraw the money. Or you can do the following, which is what I recommend. You each take some money and leave some behind to cover bills that you already agreed would be paid from joint funds. So for example, if you have $20,000 in an account, you can agree that you will leave $10,000 in there, which will pay for the mortgage and utilities. Then you will each take $5,000 to do what you want with or pay your own personal bills. If Nina and her husband handled things this way, her husband would have had the money to pay for the guys' weekend, and Nina could have saved her portion. They would have avoided the anger and resentment that spun off from this situation, and they would have saved money in legal fees having to go to court. The point is Discussing these issues now will decrease the level of conflict later. Yes, these are uncomfortable conversations to have, but it's worth the effort. In summary, create your list of joint and individual expenses, decide how each is getting paid, and agree on what will happen with the bank accounts. And remember, courts don't make decisions on emotion. They stick to the facts and the law, so don't let your emotions control you.